So to begin with, um, I'd like to talk about sex trafficking. When most people think about human trafficking, that's what they think about: forced prostitution. For good reason. There are 6.3 million women and girls in forced prostitution around the world. My first exposure to this was 35 years ago. I was living and working in Nepal. I was a public health officer, and my job was to translate resources into healthier people. At that time, we were finding girls that were 12, 13 years old who were HIV positive. We couldn't understand what was going on. That is a very conservative culture. So we went to go and interview the women and the girls, and we heard the same story over and over again. And it went something like this: a human trafficker, a guy around 20 years old, would go into the villages and flash a bunch of money around. He wanted people to think he was rich. He'd then go around saying, "I'm looking for a wife. Don't want an urban wife. I want a village wife." He'd find a girl 12, 13 years old, become friends with her, and then go to the family and say, "I'd like to marry your daughter." They're thinking, wow, he's rich, he's handsome, he's going to marry our daughter, he's going to take care of her, he's going to take care of us. Everybody's happy. In this part of the world, it's quite common to get married at that young age. Over a couple of weeks, they have a courtship, and then they actually have the wedding ceremony. The entire community is there. After the wedding, he goes to the family and says, "I'm going to take your daughter to the capital, Kathmandu, but don't worry, I'll be back in about 3 months." But that's not what's going to happen. Instead of taking her to the capital, he takes her to Mumbai, India, to the red light district where the brothels are. Now, this girl's never been more than 20 kilometers away from her village. When she's in India, she thinks she's still in Nepal. When he gets there, he puts her into a room and he says, "Honey, stay here. I'll be back in a few minutes." As they were coming into this area, she saw these men and women dressed funny. She says to her husband, "No, no, no, don't leave me. I'm scared." He says, "It's okay. I'll be right back." He then goes to the madam who runs the brothel to get the 500 US dollars for having sold her to the brothel. He has the gold from the wedding and he hands the wedding pictures over to her. He then leaves to go back to Nepal to do this again and again, maybe 40, 50 times in a year. The madam then goes into the room where the girl is and says, "Guess what? Your husband just sold you to me, and you're going to be with 20 guys a day, every day, because I say so." You can imagine her shock. "No, no, no, no. My husband loves me." She says, "No, that's what happened." When she internalizes what's going on, many of these girls say, "I will kill myself before I do those shameful things." The madam then brings out the photographs of her family. It says, "Is this your mom, your dad, your brother?" This is from the wedding. "If you hurt yourself, we will find them and hurt them." So she's trapped in this situation. In order to make her into a prostitute, it's quite simple. You shame her. So they bring in a couple of guys, and over a 2, 3, 4 day period, they'll rape this girl maybe 20, 30 times until eventually she just lays back and accepts whatever happens to her. After that, she's put on the line, which means that she will be with 20, 30 guys a day, every day, until after a couple of years when she gets what's called black eye, where she's so depleted physically and emotionally that nobody wants her. Then she's thrown out onto the street. So I was hearing this story over and over again, but I didn't understand the evil of it until I actually went to those brothels. I was invited by the Indian government to do public health checks. I had a police officer with me. I went into one of the brothels, and there was an 11-year-old trafficking victim. This girl saw this Caucasian guy, saw an opportunity, literally ran up, wrapped herself around me and said, "Save me, save me. They're doing terrible things to me." As I looked down at this child who was hysterically crying, I turned to the police officer and said, "We need to get this girl out of here." He said, "We can't do that." "So what are you talking about? You're a police officer." He says, "If we try to leave with her, we'll both be killed." To make a long story short, we left. We came back with a lot of police, but of course she was gone. Now, I tell this story because I wasn't one of those 15-year-old high school kids that said when I grow up, I want to become an activist. In fact, I did everything I could not to become an activist. But every once in a while in life, we are tested. That was my big test. I failed miserably. I didn't get her out of that. And after that, I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. So I did what a lot of activists do: surrendered to the fact that now that I've been exposed to this, This is what I'm going to do with my life. And 30 years later, here I am talking to you. But it's not just women and girls, it's men and boys. Top right-hand photo is a fishing boat in Thailand. Story behind this is a 15-year-old Cambodia boy is told by his family, you have to go to Thailand and get a job. We're poor. You need to send money back. He goes to Thailand. He's looking for work, not finding it. Human traffickers see this. They go up to him and say, hey, brother, you're from Cambodia. I'm from Cambodia. Let me lend you a little bit of money. Okay, well, now that you have my money, you have to stay with me. But guess what? I got this great job. I'm going to take you down to the ocean, put you on a boat. The boat will go out for a couple of months. You'll catch some fish. After that, the boat will come back. They'll give you a lot of money. You'll be a hero to your family. So they'll go down to the ocean. He gets on the boat. He doesn't realize he's been sold onto the boat. The boat goes out, but it doesn't come back after 3 months. It stays out for 4 years. This poor 15-year-old will end up working 17, 18 hours a day, every day. If he doesn't, he gets beaten. He gets tortured. The only food he gets the entire time he's there is rice and fish, nothing nutritious. In order to get him to work, they give strong drugs, stimulants. So his body is constantly on these drugs. Sometimes this results in an injury. If he gets injured, they don't bring the boat in. They throw him off the side of the boat. At the end of the 4 years, the boat comes in. The guy goes to the captain and says, give me something. Captain says, go away. You're illegally in my country. Guy says, I'm going to tell the police. Captain laughs and says, go ahead. We own the police. Another example of human trafficking. The bottom center photo, people from Myanmar, they're escaping the violence that's going on in that country. They hear that there's work in a place called Sumit Sakan in Thailand. There's about 4,500 seafood packing companies there. When they get down there, they knock on the door of the factory. Factory owner comes out and says, what do you need? Guy says, I'm looking for a job. Factory owner says, okay, I'll give you a job. I'll pay you the equivalent of 50 US dollars a month in local currency. But if you take my job, you have to stay in the factory. You can't leave. This person's never made more than 25 US dollars. He's thrilled. He immediately goes into the factory, takes the job, very happy, thinking that he can send money home. After a couple of months, he goes to the manager and says, I'd like to be paid. The manager says, well, I forgot to mention one thing. For you to be living in my factory with room and board and water and everything else, it cost me $54 to support you. I'm only paying you $50, not enough to even cover that. So guess what? You owe me money. So all of these people in this photo were languishing in a situation where every single day they worked, they got deeper and deeper in debt. Some of them had been there 4, 5, 6 years. They had never had an opportunity to have a day off. All their hopes and dreams and aspirations were taken away from them. Another example of human trafficking. Now, I show these 3 examples because it has relevance to the hospitality sector. There is forced prostitution that takes place in certain hotels. The fish that are caught that are used in some of the hotels often make their way to hotels. And some of the seafood packing materials, the same type thing. So this gives you a general sense of just a few variations on the theme. Another thing that we're seeing related to human trafficking is the fact that there are kind of examples of situations where trafficking takes place and a company feels like, well, we don't really feel like it's much of a problem for us. So I was in Singapore and I was presenting to a pharmaceutical company there. And after I presented to them, they said, well, we have a sophisticated system. We pay our people well. We don't have any vulnerability to human trafficking. So I asked them, how do you get your product from the warehouse to the pharmacies? They said, we use third-party contractors. I asked them if they ever looked into that, and they said no. And I said, okay, well, you should look into it. 2 weeks later, they contacted me and said, we looked into that particular organization. We found out there was excessive exploitation. Please provide some support. I presented to a law firm. The law firm says, we don't have supply chains. We don't buy that much stuff. We don't have any vulnerability. I asked them, who cleans their building? They said, well, we don't know. They looked into it and came to realize that the workers who were in the building were being exploited. The point is, as companies come to realize that they have suppliers, some of those suppliers could be tainted by modern slavery. So when it really comes down to it, and you hear me say interchangeably human trafficking and modern slavery, Now, for the most part, they're very similar, but I'm going to describe what the difference is between these two. Human trafficking was identified as terminology 35 years ago because at that time, most of the cases had a person going from one country to another country. And so they would go from, let's say, Nepal to India, and then be trafficked across the border and then put into a forced labor type situation. So because movement was required, movement across borders, they said we should use the terminology trafficking because trafficking equates movement, like drug trafficking. You take the drugs, you move them to another location, and then basically you sell them. But over time, people said, well, wait a minute. We have cases where a person is trafficked from one country to another. We have cases where a person is trafficked from one district in a country to another district, or within a city from one side of the city to the other. Who cares how the person got there? Shouldn't we focus on the exploitation? Shouldn't what we are describing have in the terminology the problem itself? And so when they ask if a person doesn't get paid and they can't leave, and they have all kinds of issues and problems associated with violence and threats and so forth, the terminology they kept coming up with was slavery. But because most people think slavery happened a long time ago, they put the word modern next to it. So modern slavery is kind of the end point of the process of human trafficking. You get trafficked into the outcome, which is modern slavery. Now, when it comes to the number of people who are associated with this, it's estimated that there are 50 million people in modern slavery. In fact, there are more slaves today than any other time in history. I'll say that again. There's more slaves today than any time in history. If I had done this presentation a year ago, it would have been 40 million. Now, the reason why it went from 40 to 50 million was COVID. During COVID, you had a lot of desperation. So let's say that you were a Bangladesh garment worker and you're making pretty good money at the local factory. And then all of a sudden, the factory closes because of COVID. Not a couple of days or weeks or months, but years. So in order to survive, you use your savings. And then you run out of the savings and you start borrowing money. Once you start borrowing money, then you owe that money. And if you can't pay it back, the money lenders are going to come back and say, well, I need a family member. They're going to end up in a sweatshop or in a fishing boat in a brothel. So that desperation has significantly increased modern slavery. When it comes to Asia, about 55% of the victims that we're dealing with are in this part of the world, basically for two reasons. There are a lot of Asian people. China, 1.4 billion people. India, 1.4 billion. And you have Pakistan and Thailand and Japan and Indonesia. All of those countries have amazingly big populations. Second, the feudal systems, the exploitative systems that have been in place for generations have never been completely dismantled. So you go to a city like Beijing, very modern, go 20 kilometers outside, you'll see systems and procedures that are generations old that have exploitation that have never been dismantled. As a result of that, we see a lot of people in modern slavery in these locations. Now, the rate at which people enter is the rate at which, at a given time, a person enters modern slavery. In a year, about 9.2 million people enter modern slavery. In a single day, 25,200 people enter somewhere in the world. In the time it takes me to do this presentation, about 1,000 people will enter modern slavery, or a new slave every 4 seconds. So if I count to 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, somewhere in the world, somebody's entering into modern slavery, and the drum beats on and on and on and on. Now, just to give you a sense of how human trafficking works, I'm going to ask my colleague, Kat, to answer a question. I'm going to offer you a job, Kat. Mm-hmm. Here it is. I will give you $1 million a year. You only have to work 4 days a week. I'll give you 2 hours off for lunch. I'll give you a house, a car, 3 months of vacation, and you can live anywhere in the world you want. Are you interested?
Wow, yeah.
Were you thinking it sounds too good to be true?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, it is too good to be true. If that job existed, I would take it. And if I could see your faces, I'm sure most of you, if you were offered a job like that, would consider it or want it. But imagine if you're somebody who is in Bangladesh and you're only making the equivalent of $5 a day, and you're never going to make more than 5. That's where you think you are. But then somebody comes up to you and says, hey, brother, how would you like to make $10 a day? And instead of working 16 and a half hours, you only have to work 14 hours, and I'll give you 2 hours off on Sunday. But you have to make the decision right now. Can't go home and talk to anyone. You either make the decision, I'm going to give it to him or to her or somebody else. And so the person is faced with this choice. If this is true, I can change my life. I could get that motorcycle. I can get that tin roof. I can get whatever I need. And so a lot of people accept this deceptive offer, get taken away, and then they're forced into human trafficking. Thank you, Kat. Another thing is debt. So let's say that you had a family member who needed an operation here in Hong Kong, and they needed 1,000 Hong Kong dollars. So they didn't have that money. So they tried to get it to the bank. Bank wouldn't give it to them. So they go to a loan shark. Loan shark gives them the money. The operation takes place. It's successful. That person goes back to try to pay the loan shark, 1,500 with interest. And the loan shark says, 1,500? That's not enough. I need 5,000. Well, you might say, well, that's not fair. You're dealing with criminals. They don't have to be fair. They make things up. So fraudulent debt is what holds people in place. So that debt, which should have been 1,200, is now 5,000. The person can't pay it back. And so the loan shark is basically saying, I need you to go and work in a factory or on a boat, in a brothel, et cetera, et cetera. So debt holds people in place. A lot of people think that human trafficking is based on kidnapping. It happens sometimes, but not very often. And the reason for that is that if somebody gets forcefully put into a van or a car, they could scream, they could kick the door and run away. It's very dangerous for the traffickers. So most trafficking cases get a person to agree to go someplace based on deception because it's easy and the person thinks something good is going to happen, only to find out when they get there something else happens. So when it comes to the age of the victims related to human trafficking, about a quarter of the cases we're dealing with would be children. The rest are adults. But most people think that human trafficking is predominantly forced prostitution, but it only represents about a quarter of the cases. The rest of the cases that we're dealing with are forced labor cases. And the reason why this is relevant is that 60% of the forced labor cases are associated with supply chains, where we get our phones and our shirts and our vegetables and fish and so forth. So we as consumers buy things, and a percentage of what we buy is tainted by modern slavery. We don't know which items we're buying that could be tainted, but on a percentage basis, we do. So to a certain extent, we are contributing to the problem. I'll come back to that point a little bit later. Okay, so who is supposed to address this issue? Well, because we're dealing with criminal activities, it's supposed to be governments. But I've worked with over 43 governments around the world, and most governments don't like this topic. It's confusing. They don't know what to do with the victims. How do you address the criminals? If you're dealing with forced labor, the police don't really want to address that particular type of crime. So governments do things, but usually not enough to have a significant impact. I worked for the United Nations for 6 years, ran one of the largest counter-trafficking programs in the world, had an office in Cambodia. But the problem with the United Nations is that many of these United Nations organizations spend a lot of time in five-star hotels, eating really good food, debating and discussing what human trafficking is. It's too theoretical. They're not getting close enough to the action. And as a result of that, they're not able to make much of a difference. So it's the non-government organizations that are making the lion's share of the support to address modern slavery. They're the ones that go and after the bad guys and do prevention activities and help victims to get on their feet and so forth. But again, if we go back to the statistics, if 77% of what we're dealing with is forced labor and 62% of that is associated with supply chains, who else has to be associated with this? The private sector. But if you think governments don't like this topic, the private sector hates it because most people think the private sector would willingly and knowingly use slave labor for shareholder profits. Now, in reality, major private companies and hotels and banks and manufacturers would do anything and everything to avoid exploitation. It's dangerous for their reputation. But most consumers think that's the case. Another point that I'll come back to a little bit later. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is show you how many people were helped out of modern slavery last year out of the 50 million, with all of the United Nations and governments and the NGOs and the private sectors combined working together. So think in your mind what a good number would be. Then I'm going to show you, out of 500,000 criminals around the world, how many of them actually were convicted. Think of what a good number would be. And here are the results. Last year, out of 50 million people, 108,000 of them were helped. Actually, the number down below is wrong. It should be 108. That's 0.2% of the victims. Not even 1% of the victims are helped each year. Out of 500,000 criminals, about 6,000 of them were convicted. That's 1.2%. Wow, when you look at this, you might ask the question, does the counter-trafficking world not care? Are we not doing our job? Are we lazy? That's not the issue. The issue is this: the profits generated from modern slavery are $236 billion a year, second only to drug trafficking, the second largest transnational crime. The amount of funding that is available locally to be able to address this globally is about 350 million, or 0.13%. So you have huge profits that the bad guys have and only a little money relative to that in order to address the issues. To put the amount of money that is used to address modern slavery into perspective, in the United States, we eat a lot of potato chips, $6 billion worth a year. It takes 21 days of potato chip eating to come up with the equivalent amount of money that's available local to address modern slavery. You can see what it is we're up against. Another thing is the scale. The number of people out there who are doing human trafficking is about 500,000. The number of people who do the work that I do, who work on this full time, is about 30,000 people. We have to follow rules and regulations and get donor money and progress reports. If you're a criminal, you don't have to do any of those things. So basically, you can break the law. If anyone gets close to your business, you can mutate and change your business. You can hurt somebody. As a result of that, the bad guys have a very big advantage. And lastly, awareness. Now, usually, if I'm in front of an audience, I would ask the question, how many of you in this audience knew 25% of what I was saying today? And usually I wouldn't get any hands at all, or maybe one or two hands. If you don't know about an issue, you're not going to care about it. If you don't care about it, you're not going to do anything. And so it's really not your fault. We in the counter-trafficking world haven't done a good enough job of helping to raise awareness so that you know about these particular issues. And that's why we do these talks, in order to help you to understand the relevance of this topic, not only to yourself, but to the organization that you are with. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to change gears a little bit. I'm going to ask the question, how did this issue of human trafficking find its way into the private sector? Why are banks talking about this? Why are manufacturers talking about it? Why are, hospitality organizations talking about it? And a lot of it really comes down to that statistic of 0.2%. When governments came to realize that the NGO world and the United Nations and the governments weren't having much impact, but at the same time, there was a relationship between this issue and the private sector, they said, well, we need to bring the private sector into this to be able to address this. As a result of this, you see some trends that are taking place in the business world. But because many of these trends are geared towards forcing the private sector to do something, they almost become a business risk. And so I'll talk a little bit about this to give you a general sense of what I'm talking about. The first trend that we see related to getting the private sector involved in addressing modern slavery is expanding legislation. So prior to 2012, every once in a while, the governments and the private companies and the NGOs would come together and they would talk about issues related to human rights and human trafficking and so forth. It would often result in conferences and panel discussion, and sometimes reports like the UN Principles on Business and Human Rights, or conventions within the United Nations. The work and the outcome of this is excellent, and it's available, but it's not mandatory. You can choose to use it or not use it. The first real legislation related to companies like yours that are involved in this happened in 2012 with transparency legislation. In 2012, California Transparency Supply Chain Act was put into play. At that time, Arnold Schwarzenegger, the guy who played the Terminator in the movie, who was the governor at that time, put this law in place. And what the law basically said is that if you are a big company and you even have one product in California, you have to put on your website what you're doing to address the issue of modern slavery. If you're not doing anything at all, and you say that, you are in compliance, but you have to say something. A couple of years later, the UK Modern Slavery Act was put in place. That act basically did the same thing, but it said you have to do two additional things. In addition to putting something on your website, you have to have an annual report that describes all the things that you're doing to address modern slavery. It's usually about 20 pages. And that annual report has to be signed by the board of directors. After that, the French put an act in place, and the Australians have put it in place, and the Germans and so forth. So with each one of these acts, if you're a hotel and you're in one of these locations, you have to respond to this. You have to say what it is that you're doing. And so that's the relevance of this when it comes to how legislation is creating this vulnerability for organizations. So you see a trend. In the early days, it was just about a website posting, and then it was an annual report. Well, the German Act says you have to have a grievance mechanism. So if you have a company that has a supply chain, you have to have a grievance mechanism for the entire supply chain. The Canadian Act says if you find modern slavery, we're going to fine and penalize you. So with each one of these acts, it gets a little bit more specific, and it creates additional requirements that a company has to address. The second thing would be lawsuits. Now, we're not seeing it in this part of the world, but in the United States, there are lawsuits against motels and hotels that have been caught with sex trafficking victims being used in their motel. So, for example, if a 14-year-old girl is basically forced to have prostitution in a hotel and the police do a raid and rescue, that hotel could be sued. And what's happening is those lawsuits are resulting in high payouts. They're winning because of the moral repugnance of a 14-year-old girl being forced into this situation. Those lawsuits are resulting in 250,000 or $500,000 or $1 million US. Now, when it comes to the amount of money, that's not really the problem for the hotel industry. The problem is that the insurance companies are now saying, well, we don't know if we can insure the hospitality sector because we're the ones paying those fees. And so this is creating an issue for North American hospitality organizations. Now, eventually this will spill over into Europe and possibly Asia. At present, it's just in North America, but you can see where this trend is going. Another thing that we're seeing is significant increases in media coverage related to this topic. Now, those of you who are a little bit older know that in the 1990s, almost every day you would see an article or expose on HIV/AIDS, because at that time it was a new thing and a lot of people were interested in it. When was the last time you heard something on HIV/AIDS? Probably not for a long time. And the reason for that is that at that particular period of time, people wanted to hear about it. But that particular issue was replaced with another issue, with climate change. So for 15 years, we've been hearing about climate change and global warming and so forth. The new emerging issue of our time, which started about 7 years ago, is now modern slavery and human trafficking. And so what we've seen is a doubling every year for the last number of years on this particular topic. So as you get more information on this topic out to consumers, the more questions are asked, the more appetite there is for more. Most of the press related to this is negative. It's talking about, sweatshops. It's talking about sex trafficking. It's talking about businesses that get caught in a particular situation. And so you will expect to see more and more coverage of this over time. Another thing is ESG. Now, most of you know that ESG is a metric that is used by the private sector to basically gauge how a corporation is doing related to addressing environmental issues or governance issues or social issues. The S in ESG in social side of this includes modern slavery, and there are certain indicators that are related to modern slavery that companies are going to have to measure. So prior to COVID, most major corporations that were measuring ESG were choosing which indicators that they were going to use. So let's say that you're an electric car company and you pick a lot of environmental indicators because it shows that you're doing right, you don't have fossil fuels being burned, et cetera, in governance. And it looks like your company is doing great, and investors start investing in it and so forth. But recently, I was in the United States, I was in Canada talking to lawmakers, and they said, well, we want to now regulate ESG. We want to standardize it. So every company needs to fill out certain indicators. So instead of cherry picking what the indicators are, what's going to happen is that same car company is going to have social indicators, but their scores are going to go right down because the lithium and the cobalt that is used in the batteries for their cars comes from a place where there's a lot of modern slavery. And so ESG has the potential to basically measure whether companies are doing right by the environment or not. I had one lawmaker say it's kind of like eventually having a naughty and a nice list, where you're going to be able to measure which companies are doing right by the world and which are not. The reason why this is relevant is because a lot of people care about this. There was a major study of millennials in the United States, and it measured investors in their interest in ESG, and 84% of them said that they value ESG. And these same investors will be the fund managers for the retirement funds and all of the various things that are out there in the real world. So as a result of this, companies have to be concerned about these things. So what you saw from this basically was, why is the private sector getting involved? And they're getting involved because governments have come to accept the fact that the NGOs can't do this. There's a nexus with the private sector. So you see what the trends are. So what I'm going to do now is talk specifically about the hotels. Okay, the hotel industries includes big giant hotel chains. It includes individual hotels, small hotels, mom and pop hotels, and so forth, but they all are included in this particular category. Why should the hotels care about this particular issue? And the answer to the question is that, first of all, most hospitality organizations don't know much about this. If you don't know much about a particular issue, you're not going to care about it. If you don't care about it, you're not going to do anything. And so it's really important for the hospitality industry to at least understand the issue, because there is relevance with the seafood that you buy, with the employees that you hire, with the possibility of sex trafficking taking place. And so awareness is a big and important part of this. The other thing that is relevant to the hospitality sector is the fact that there are 4 discrete areas of vulnerability. The first one is supply chains. You buy things. It could be linen, it could be fish, it could be something else. You contract workers. Like, for instance, in Macau has a huge hospitality industry. In Macau, there are very few local people who work in the hotels. They bring people from the outside in, migrants. When migrants come from one place to another, the possibility of vulnerability is there for these particular migrants. Construction, when hotels are being built, there's the possibility that the hotel could have workers within the hotel building structure that are being exploited. And then there's forced prostitution. So let me go through each of these one at a time so that we can talk about the vulnerability associated with this. The first is, again, the possibility of naming and shaming. You may remember in this part of the world, in Asia, about 15 years ago, there was an emphasis on shark fin soup, where basically the world was saying sharks were being caught, and then they'd cut the fins off and then throw the sharks into the water, and then they'd die a painful death. And there was a real big campaign to stop shark fin soup. And as a result of that, if hotels were serving it, then they would be called out, their names would be in the newspaper. The same type of thing is happening within the modern slavery world. So, for example, large retailers are buying seafood from Thailand, and they're being sued for that. Or articles and exposés are being put in the paper to say these retailers are buying these products, they're contributing to modern slavery. Up until now, it hasn't gone into the hotel industry, but it's moving in that direction. The possibility of you buying from a particular supplier in Thailand and somebody coming back and saying this hotel is buying from this supplier and this supplier is exploiting people is certainly there. You have to be aware of the fact that this possible trend is in place. And in fact, we're seeing this within the seafood industry. As I said, the retailers, the plaintiffs are basically suing major companies and saying, well, because you're buying from Thailand, you're supporting modern slavery. In those cases, they're insisting that the retailers use their influence to stop this from happening. You know, if you're a retailer and you're buying Thailand, you don't have any influence locally on this. And so the lawsuits aren't being won. But what happens is the information related to this spills over into the newspapers, into the social media. It becomes embarrassing for particular companies. That's why you have to be aware of this. The chocolate industry gets sued all the time because in the locations in Africa where chocolate beans come from, you have a lot of kids that are taken out of schools, forced to basically work. Many of them don't get paid. Imagine the chocolate industry being associated with modern slavery. The chocolate industry wants to be associated with Easter and Valentine's Day, and they want people to really think of good things when it comes to chocolate. If all of a sudden you put modern slavery next to the name of chocolate, it creates a big issue. So the naming and shaming possibility associated with industries that have a supply chain that is tainted by modern slavery is a problem. And if any of those products make it into your facilities, it could also be a problem for you. So when it comes to your procurement, it's really important. And we're seeing this. I work in Hong Kong and Macau and across Asia for you to know the suppliers that you have, to identify which of them have systems and procedures in place to avoid the chocolate or the fish or the linen or the furniture from being tainted by modern slavery. So there are risk assessment tools that are available. We work with hotels that use these tools. And sometimes if a product comes from a risky country and it has the possibility of a risk that would come back to them, they basically audit the company to make sure that there's no issues, or they call them up. And so what we're seeing is this trend where the hospitality sector is looking at their own suppliers in a much more way. This is an example of a tool that is used by the hotels. And the way it works is you identify where the supplier is, and based on the country, there's a certain vulnerability. But then you ask the supplier specific questions. Do you raise awareness? Do you have a code of conduct? Do you train your people? Do you basically have remediation? Do you provide grievance mechanisms? And based on this, the hotel determines the vulnerability of that particular supplier to them. And then they can make choices based on that. We also work with organizations that provide training materials to suppliers so the suppliers themselves know what it means to avoid indicators of modern slavery. And I can give links to all of these tools just so that you get a general sense of it at a later time when we give information back to you. Another thing is third-party contractors. Now, in Cambodia, many of the people who work in hotels are local, but in many other hotels, people are brought in from outside. And so when you bring somebody from another country, there's always the vulnerability that that person can be exploited. So let me give you an example. And this is an example between Nepal and Malaysia, but it's relevant to other parts of Asia as well. So in this particular case, you have a person from Nepal, and let's say he's a villager. And he lives in his village and he makes about 30 US dollars a month. And he's never going to make more than $30. But a recruitment agent goes into his village and says to this guy, how would you like to make 250 US dollars a month? The guy says, wow, that sounds great. What do I need to do? Well, you have to come with me to Kathmandu. You have to sign some documents. You have to get a passport and plane tickets, and we'll train you, and then we'll send you to Malaysia, and your life is going to be good. Oh, wait a minute. There's one more thing. You have to give us 1,500 US dollars for that to happen. So the villager says, well, I don't have that kind of money. The recruitment agency says, don't worry about it. We'll find somebody to lend it to you. You can pay it back very quickly. So he signs an agreement, not understanding that the interest rates and the fees and all of the other costs associated with this agreement compound very quickly. He doesn't realize by the time he gets from his village to Kathmandu, the capital, 1,500 is now 3,000. By the time he gets to Malaysia, it's 4,500. So he gets to Malaysia, he starts working in a hotel, but he ends up working for 2 or 3 years just to pay back those fees. So this is called debt bondage, and it's an indicator of modern slavery because he's held in place because of the debt. He can't leave because of that debt. Another thing that happens is related to contracts. He signs a contract in Nepal. Maybe he has it read to him if he can't read, or he reads it, signs it. When he gets to Malaysia, the hotel gives him another contract. It's in a completely different language. He looks at it and says, I don't know what it says. I can't sign it. Hotel says, you got to sign it. I don't know. You sign it, you're going to lose everything. We're going to send you back. So he signs it, not realizing that there's additional fees and targets and various other things. So he's not really making $250 a month. He's actually making about $125. And again, that money is being used in order to pay for the debt he has. Another thing that happens when he gets to Malaysia, they ask for the passport, but they don't give it back to him. They say they need it for visas and so forth. After a couple of years, he says, I've had enough. I'm going to go back home. He goes to the hotel and says, I want my passport. They say, no. He says, what do you mean, no? Give me my passport. He says, no, you said you're going to work here for 4 years. You're going to stay here. Guy says, I'm going to tell the police. The hotel says, go ahead. Who are they going to believe, you or us? We're going to say we don't have it. You're going to be without your documentation. They're going to put you in a remand center. You're going to have a lot of pain and suffering as a result of that. So this is how some of the indicators of modern slavery play out, and why you have to kind of understand what these indicators are. I mentioned construction. You know, the typical construction issue that we see in this part of the world, I'll use Thailand as an example, where there's a hotel being built in a particular location. You know, that contract has been given over to a major contractor, but you know, when it comes to the technical jobs and the people who do the plumbing and electricity, those people get paid well. But when it comes to this moving the sand and the bricks and everything, they hire local people. So a person from Cambodia goes up to the foreman and I'd like a job. The foreman says, okay, I'll give you a job, but I can't pay you right away. You have to wait for 3 months before I pay you. I'm waiting for payment and so forth. So the person accepts the job, works for 3 months. After that, goes to the foreman, says, I'd like to be paid. Foreman says, well, I need another 2 months. Then it's another 2 months. Then it's another 2 months. So the person is there working, borrowing money, getting very, very frustrated, eventually puts a lot of pressure on the foreman. The next day when he comes, there's an immigration car there. Person gets picked up, taken to a remand center, eventually put across the border into Cambodia. There was a relationship between the immigration office and the construction site. He was never going to get paid. This is another form of modern slavery. So as a result of these particular actions and approaches, what you're seeing is that major companies are stepping up. They're putting policies in places. Hotels are having policies that say that we have zero tolerance related to human trafficking. And all of our employees will be trained, and everyone is going to get everything that they need in order to address this. I do a lot of training of hotels and of brands on this particular topics, because the brands want everyone to understand what it is that I'm talking about. And this is an example of the type of training that we often offer. There's a lot more social audits that are taken. Hotels that are looking at their suppliers of seafood, they're looking at their suppliers of furniture and linen and various other products they have. They're making sure that the people who are being recruited into their hotels are not being cheated by the recruitment agents or anybody else. They're ensuring that the people who are being brought in to work in their hotels have no debt, that the payment is made by somebody else, and as a result of that, the indebtedness doesn't hold them in place. And we're seeing hotlines and whistleblower hotlines and various other things that are set up to basically allow for employees to be able to address this. And so we're seeing this transaction taking place in Asia, Africa, North America, et cetera, et cetera. And again, it's based on the fact that if you don't do these things, there's a certain vulnerability related to this particular topic. The last section that I'll focus on is forced prostitution. And so I lived and worked in Thailand for a number of years. And during the time that I was there, I worked with a lot of the hotels. And the hotels have a real struggle when it comes to prostitution or sex trafficking, because They have clients, people who are staying in the hotels, and it's really uncomfortable if they see somebody, let's say a 55-year-old guy coming in with a 12-year-old girl, and it's not the person's daughter, and it's 3 o'clock in the morning, and it's about to be, sex trafficking case and so forth. What do you say? Do you say something? Do you not say something? And so some hotels do, many hotels don't. And so hotels are trying to figure out what is the approach that they will use related to this. So often hotels will sign the code or have codes of conduct that say that they have zero tolerance to this. They put protocols in place to ensure that if a particular scenario takes place, that they're able to address it. That might be sex trafficking. Training is offered to their staff and so forth. But it's a choice. It's up to each hotel to determine whether they do this or don't do this. And so, as I mentioned, I do a fair amount of training at hotels where we train the employees and we help them to understand what is sex trafficking, what needs to be done. Senior management is trained on this. And then many of the hotels will put a protocol in. If they think that there's vulnerability to sex trafficking, they decide how does the front desk address, the management address, the security address, and so forth. So these are things that hotels have to decide based on whether or not this is a topic that they want to address. So what they're looking for are red flags or indicators of modern slavery. And these are just a handful of them. There are many, many more of them. So, for example, if you have somebody who checks in and there are numerous men coming and going from rooms, maybe there's a girl being used in the room. Room payments on by cash, so there's no record of it. Refusal of cleaning services. So they don't want anyone to go in there and clean. So for 2 or 3 days, there's no cleaning, asking for lots of towels. Sometimes these rooms will have a security person, somebody kind of sitting out in front who's just watching the room. The room contains a lot of condom containers, the used condom package and so forth. These would be indicators of a sex trafficking situation or prostitution taking place in your hotel. The victim themselves, it could be that the girl is chaperoned around. There's always an older person, often a male, that's with that individual. When they check into the hotel, few possessions. She doesn't make eye contact. If you talk to her, it almost sounds like she has rehearsed responses related to, questions from where she comes from and so forth. She's not allowed to speak. In some cases, you can see signs of abuse, a black eye or a sore on the arm or something else. She is treated in an aggressive manner by the adults or wearing inappropriate clothes for her age. If she's like 13 years old and very provocative clothes, maybe this would be an indicator. So these are the types of things that you get trained on related to this. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is talk a little bit about the organization that I work with. It's called the Mekong Club. We are based in Hong Kong, but we work all over the world. And we work with the private sector in a positive, supportive, non-naming and shaming way. And we do this in order to help raise awareness within the private sector. The types of organizations we work with are banks. And the reason why banks are interested in this topic is that, as I mentioned, $236 billion is generated from modern slavery. If any of that money gets into a legitimate bank, the bank gets fined. There was one bank in Australia that was fined 1.3 billion Australian dollars because they allowed for sex trafficking activities to take place, and somebody found out about it, and then they were fined that. Obviously, the manufacturers and the retailers have to be concerned about this, and I talked about how the hotel industry is affected. And so what we do is when we onboard organizations into our association, we do a baseline to see where that particular business is in their journey in addressing modern slavery. So we ask questions: do you raise awareness? Do you provide training? Does your leadership know about this? Do you have risk assessments and so forth? And based on that, you can get a general sense of where the gaps are and so forth. Our community also meets on a quarterly basis to debate and discuss. The hotels come together. What is needed within the hotel industry to protect them? So this might result in tools. One of the tools that we have, for example, is a hospitality checklist. And this checklist addresses all the things that I was talking about. We're in the process of putting this into multiple languages. It will be in Khmer. in the near future. And this particular checklist can be used by hotels basically to ask general questions. And so it's a drop-down menu type of approach. So if you want to understand general policies, you hit it, and then you get, what's the issue? And then with each of these categories, you go deeper and deeper into it. And it allows for organizations to identify what's the minimum amount that they have to do in order to address modern slavery. We developed e-learning tools in multiple languages. I think we also have this in Khmer as well. And, basically to educate and inform the people within the hotel what they need to know related to human trafficking. What is the issue? What's the legislation? How does it relate to the hospitality sector? What does the hospitality sector do? And we put this into multiple languages. Okay, so what I'm going to do now, I only have a couple of more slides before I finish, is to just talk about this as an activist to individuals who just heard me talk about this. You heard me talk about the cases and women and girls and sex trafficking and forced labor and so forth. So what I'm going to do now is to just give you my perspective as somebody who's addressed this for a long time. And so I'm going to do this by giving you a story. So years ago, when I was living and working in Nepal, I desperately wanted to do something to address the issue of modern slavery. So I decided I was going to write a book. As part of that book writing process, I went from shelter to shelter to interview the women and the girls. I went to one shelter and there was a girl named Gita. And every time I approached her, she said, no. I don't want to give my story. But as I interviewed all these other women, she was sitting there listening to everything I said. When I finished and I was leaving, Gita comes running up to me and she said, I changed my mind. I'll give you my story. So I said, oh, that's great. So Gita sat on one side of the table. The rest of us sat on the other side of the table. In over a 3-hour period, she told the worst story I had ever heard of rape and torture and disease and betrayal. Honestly, I'd heard many stories. This was the worst one I had ever heard. I didn't know what to say to her. So after a few minutes, I finally turned to her and I said, wow, Gita, you must be so angry at the traffickers for the horrible things they did to you. She paused and paused. And then she said, no, I'm angry at you and you and you. She pointed at us. She said, where were you? She said that every single day she woke up praying for somebody to come and help her. Nobody came. She said she went to school till she was 12. She knew that all of the activities in that brothel area or in the hotel she was going in was right out in the open. Nobody was doing anything. She said she wasn't angry at the traffickers. She said they are just bad people being bad people. She said she was angry at the good people, at society for allowing a 15-year-old girl to be commercially raped 7,000 times only to eventually get AIDS and she was dying. I tell this story because Gita called us all out. She recognized that the 30,000 people like me was never going to be enough to get above 1%, and that the only way we're going to be able to address this issue is if the world steps up and cares. So I often say to the audiences I present to, if I could get each of you to do one thing a year related to this topic, that would be 1 times 45. Or if I'm in front of an audience of 1,000 people, I say one thing from you, that would be 1 times 1,000. Now, a lot of people say, well, what could I possibly do? I'm not in the NGO world or whatever. Well, one thing you can do is to learn about this particular issue. And guess what? With this 1-hour presentation, you now know about it. You've done your one thing. You don't have to do anything else. You have already achieved that. But imagine if you were to go and tell another person, and another person, and another person, you've done another thing, and another thing, and another thing. Another thing that you can do is basically, make sure that within your organization, there are systems and procedures. Or you can be a responsible consumer. Before you buy a particular product, go online to see it on their website, whether they have a policy. If they do, congratulate them. If they don't, say, listen, I really like your products. I'd feel better if you had some type of a policy associated with this. It's very simple. You can do it in a very positive, respectful way. You can volunteer. Our organization has about 150 volunteers. Many of them are from different professional banks or hospitality or whatever, because people want to give back. And so basically, my youngest volunteer was a 9-year-old girl. She saw me in a documentary and she contacted me somehow and she said, Mr. Friedman, I saw that this is a terrible thing. I want to help. I looked at this girl and I said, well, you're 9 years old. She said, so what? I said, you're 9 years old. She said 9-year-olds are the new 16-year-olds. Give me a chance. So I asked her, what is it that you can do? She said she can find anything on the internet. So I gave her some tasks that I had tried to give to my second year Yale law students. They couldn't find it online. And 2 days later, she found all of this, sent it to me, and said, what can I do next? Because that was her God-given gift. She was good at that. Every one of us is good at something. Maybe it's public speaking, maybe it's fundraising, maybe it's writing, maybe it's selling t-shirts. It doesn't matter. You apply that to volunteerism, it makes a big difference. Fundraising or donating. There are organizations in Cambodia that focus on this issue. They need resources. If you skip a meal and just take that money and donate it to an organization, it makes a big difference. So there's a lot that we can do as human beings in order to address this. The last story relates to kind of the fact that the private sector is already doing things related to human trafficking. For example, I was in Washington, D.C., and I was at a conference. I presented to a bunch of banks. And at the end of that presentation, this guy comes up to me and says, Mr. Friedman, I want to tell you a story that happens to public speakers. And I said, yeah, go ahead and tell me the story. He said he was taking his wife and his teenage daughter from one part of the United States to the other. And they were driving, and when they got to the halfway point, they pulled into a motel. He got his wife and daughter settled, and he was going out for food. And as he was leaving, he saw this like 14-year-old girl being dragged into a room by an older guy. He knew it had something to do with prostitution. He had a teenage daughter. He was really bothered by this. So he went to the office to report it to them. And he told them what he saw. And then he went back to his room, and he's peeking out the window to see if anything happened. Sure enough, 15 minutes later, the police come. 15 minutes later, this guy is being taken out in handcuffs. Another car takes the girl, presumably to a shelter. He said, I want to just tell you that this was a momentous experience. I'm so proud of myself. I feel so good about this, and I wanted to tell you. So I looked at the guy and I said, well, what do you do? He says, well, I'm a banker. I said, yeah, you're at a banking conference. What do you do? He says, I do, analysis to determine whether or not there's criminal activities associated with the money that makes it into the bank. I asked the guy, do you run human trafficking cases? He said, yeah, I do. And I asked, what do you do? He says, well, I fill out a report and we give it off to the authorities. So I looked at this guy and I said, dude, do you not realize that you're a hero? By you doing that, by you doing your job to protect the bank, you're already sending these things out. The police might go do the same thing that you saw there. Don't you realize that that's heroic? And it took him a few minutes to kind of understand the fact that, yeah, by me doing this, I'm actually helping. So a couple of months later, I'm in Singapore. I do a presentation to 650 bankers, and I tell them that story. And I say to the audience, you guys, by you addressing the issue of modern slavery, you're protecting your organization, but you're also making the world a better place. You're heroes. I must have had 30 people come up to me afterwards and say, wow, nobody ever gives us a pat on the back and says that to us. But you're right. By us doing this, we're protecting it. In the hotel industry, it's the same way. By you looking to see whether or not your supply chains are free of modern slavery, by you ensuring that the employees that you have, that they're not being exploited, by ensuring that your construction sites are not being marred by exploitative behavior, and by ensuring that sex trafficking doesn't take place, you're doing heroic things. You're making the world a better place. And that's a very important point. So with that, I'm going to stop. Thank you very much for your attention. I really appreciate it. I'm open to any questions that anybody might have.